Let me go to Max Alexander, representing Oliver Wyman. And as Mark already said, you are an international consultancy with quite some experience in aviation and rail as well, specifically on dynamic pricing and yield management. What can you teach the coach sector, Max Alexander, from your experiences in the rail and aviation sector?
Yeah, so we will. I will try to walk us through a little bit of some of the core concepts of dynamic pricing. And I think the sentiment in the beginning was quite right, that dynamic pricing will probably have a tremendous impact after COVID, not only from a perspective of how you can maximize your revenues, but also in terms of steering demand towards capacity which might be underutilized and which might be able to pick up some more demand given social distancing constraints. So I will try to walk you through some of the core concepts. I mean, given the short amount of time that we have today, we won't be able to probably go into a whole lot of detail, but if I can answer any questions afterwards, I'll be more than happy to do so. So Hannes, if you could walk us to the next page, please. So maybe let's start with the question: why should we as a bus industry think about pricing in the first place? And this is an illustrative picture from a pre-COVID time, where we looked at a Paris to London route in a workday 8 to 10 a.m. departure range, so quite narrow time window. We had 7 different connections here, and you could see the cheapest one priced at 19 euros, yeah, at the bottom. It had a traveling time of 8 hours, and the next cheapest competitor was at roughly 25 euros with a traveling time of 9 hours. So that means that the cheapest competitor here actually undercut the next cheapest one by 25%, despite having a comparable, if not even better, service offering. And while this is an example, it's quite a typical picture that we've seen, and we've come to the conclusion that the potential from superior pricing in the bus industry is quite tremendous. And I will also give you at least 1 or 2 figures towards the end, what the typical uplift potential is that we see from other industries if proper pricing, dynamic pricing is implemented. So if we go to the next page, please, where are we coming from if we talk about dynamic pricing? There's a classical trade-off between obviously having a higher price per passenger or higher load factor. And the concept of dynamic pricing, sometimes also referred to as yield management or revenue management, is essentially to say, how can I optimize my revenues by how can I optimize the formula of yield times load factor? And that's exactly what dynamic pricing is about. Let's go through a simple example on the next page, please. So this is an example taken from an airline, but we could apply it in a very similar way to the bus industry as well. Let's assume a case where we have an airplane flying from A to B, which has fixed costs of roughly 30,000 euros for this trip. We ignore any variable costs here, which are negligible anyhow. If we assume that this airline could only sell its tickets for one price, what would happen? Yeah? If we look at the price demand function on the left-hand side, if we were to assume it could only set a price of 200 euros, then 100 passengers would book this trip, and 100 passengers times 200 euros would give you overall revenues of 20,000, which would lead to a loss of 10,000 euros. If we assume you would set the price at 400 euros and you wouldn't be able to set another price point, you would have only 50 passengers. Booking price would be higher. 50 passengers times 400 euros again gives you 20,000 euros in revenues, and again a loss of 10,000. The last example is if the price was 600 euros, you'd only have 25 passengers willing to pay that amount of money for such a trip. You'd end up with revenues of 15,000, make a 15,000 euro loss. So taking this simplified but honestly quite realistic example, if airlines could only choose one point, they'd probably make a lot all the time. So the answer to that obviously is having multiple price points. If we go to the next page, this is what we've demonstrated here. Essentially, dynamic pricing means you charge different price points to different customer groups. And so here we say there are 50 passengers who are willing to who we can charge only 200 euros. We have another 25 passengers who we are able to charge 400 euros, and there are additional 25 passengers who are even willing to pay 600 euros. And if we add all those revenues up, we come to a total revenue, the figure of 35,000, which gives us a healthy 5,000 euro profit on this trip. Now, obviously, this requires different instruments. One thing I won't go into much detail here is that obviously you need to be able to fence the different customer segments that you have, be it by limitations of flexibility, by Saturday night stay rules, so that you can only buy a round trip at a cheaper price if you stay over a weekend, because that allows an airline to fence private from business demand, and so on and so forth. Not going to go into this right now, but important to know that that you need to be able to fence the different customer segments, of course. What is important in addition to that is on the next page, is you need to understand the concepts of opportunity cost on the one hand and willingness to pay on the other hand. Opportunity cost essentially means how much more can I earn if I don't sell a seat right now, but I wait for another passenger to book it later for a higher price. That, of course, requires me to have a quite good picture of how many passengers are willing to book a seat on a trip at which point of time, and that requires you to be able to have somewhat proper forecasting. The other concept is the one of willingness to pay, and that's essentially independent of supply and demand. What is the willingness to pay of different types of passengers, which can be influenced either by the fact if someone is traveling for leisure purposes or for business purposes. It can also be influenced by competitive rates and so on and so forth. That typically can be done with a lot of analytics for industries who are not as mature in dynamic pricing. A lot of that can also be done by codified experience. Let's stay on the left-hand side for a second and talk a little bit about forecasting and why forecasting is important and beneficial. And Hannes, if I may ask you to go to the next page, please. Proper forecasting is important, at least from my perspective, for four reasons. The first one is if you are able to forecast properly which type of customers book trips on your route, then it does allow you to charge higher prices to later booking customers, and you do not out too cheaply in the beginning. The second one is condition price-sensitive customers to book as early as possible, so you can educate them on your pricing policy, and that facilitates you or makes it easier for you to segment earlier booking price-sensitive demand from later booking higher yielding demand. Yeah. The third one is you minimize irritation, because if you have proper forecasting, as said, you can educate your customers that prices become step by step more expensive throughout the booking period, and you do not have to open and close booking classes at different points of time, or make different price points, higher and lower price points available back and forth, which leads to a lot of irritation and frustration with customers. So proper forecasting avoids that as well. And finally, forecasting is a very analytically driven exercise that typically supports a lot the learning process within an organization, because you can improve the way how you structure products, which features are offered to which customer groups, with which flexibility rules around it, and other features around it. And typically that there's an important aspect of linking forecasting, pricing, and product in that regard. Why does it make sense to do all this? How much dividend does it pay? At airlines, we typically see when we go into an airline and help them optimize their forecasting, we see revenue uptakes of 1 to 2% from better forecasting. That being said, airlines are typically already quite well educated on forecasting, and from our experience in the bus industry, the revenue uplift can be even higher, because typically the degree of sophistication in forecasting is not that high. If you combine that with other elements like optimizing your understanding of the willingness to pay of different customers and ancillary revenue pricing, etc., then the uplift can be in the range of 4 to 5% in revenues. And since this is really then improved pricing, the bottom line impact is quite substantial. So I think my last page is then the one about asking how sophisticated is the bus industry already with regards to forecasting and dynamic pricing. Again, this is an illustrative example from two European markets, one from Berlin and Amsterdam, the other one Manchester. And essentially what this picture tells us, while some markets are not mature, others are way more mature. On the left-hand side, if you look at the Berlin-Amsterdam example, you see there are overall, the number of price points is not that high. And you do see that different players, in particular player number 2, is actually starting to price high in the beginning on the right-hand side, where we have around 450 hours before departure. And then prices actually go down closer to departure. Apparently, this is a player who then realized, or who tried to sell seats at a quite high price, then realized demand is not picking up as expected, and then started to make cheaper price points available, which for different reasons you probably do not want to see in your booking curve. Whereas on the right-hand side, and this may be good news for John, I'm sure National Express is one of the players here. There's a much more sophisticated picture. You can see typically players start with lower prices for quite a period of time, give an opportunity to price-sensitive customers to book early, and then when it comes closer to departure, people really have a need to travel quickly within the next day or two, the prices have become much higher. And this also on the right-hand side is the typical picture that we see with more sophisticated airlines. So that was my last page. I hope it provided a nice introduction around some of the core concepts of dynamic pricing. And happy to take any questions.
Indeed, thank you so much, Max Alexander. This was very interesting. Your statistics were quite clear and everything. But how does a coach company who does not apply dynamic pricing yet, how do they start? What are the first steps to make? How do we move on this?
So I think there are, I mean, obviously, and you know this way better than I do, but the bus and coach industry is quite fragmented, and I think if you have larger players who have the capabilities to do data analytics, the situation is very different to smaller companies. But overall, I think what we've seen is you do have to have a certain level of confidence of data management and data analytics. But what you can do quite nicely is you can run experiments. Yeah, you can test out what is the willingness to pay of your customers, and simply take records of which price points work at which period of time, and then you play around with that, and you learn from that. And improve it stepwise. For companies that are larger and have data capabilities, you can automate that much more. You can set up professional experiments across a larger set of routes. You can set up comparable routes and learn from that.
Yeah, thank you so much. One of our attendees also is asking the question. Now, since the pre-booking period in the coach sector, is much shorter than it is in aviation or in hotel management. How does that influence dynamic pricing policies?
I mean, it does influence it quite a bit. From my perspective, we won't see as many different price points as we see it in airlines, for example. But I think the result cannot be that we say we only stick to 1 or 2 price points. The question is, in a time range which is quite short, can you have 3, 4, 5 different price points that you can test against? And probably also forecasting won't be as sophisticated as you know it in the airline industry. So you have to be much more pragmatic about it. But to be honest, also from our experience, the booking periods differ quite a bit by market, also continent by continent. And you will have to look at different markets and routes, how to tailor it optimally. But overall, I don't think that should be an excuse to say we cannot do any forecasting. It just has to be probably a bit more pragmatic than in other industries.
Okay. Does dynamic pricing increase the number of complaints that the operator is receiving due to the fact that he's getting a price that he was not expecting?
So we haven't seen complaints as in customers really calling up and say, hey, I paid this much last week and now I'm paying more this week. Not necessarily, but what we have seen quite a bit is irritation if you don't do it properly. So if you don't do any forecasting and you randomly make higher and then lower and then higher and then lower price points again, customers feel like it becomes completely random, and that's again why we believe educating customers on your pricing policy is important. And I think you can communicate quite nicely with marketing that you say, if you want to have a good deal, you need to book early. That typically can work quite well, but there's a bit of education required around it.
Okay. How do you apply dynamic pricing in regulated markets, where minimum prices are fixed and known? How does it work there?
I mean, if it's completely regulated, of course, then there's very little you can do. I think the interesting question brings us a bit back to the COVID situation that we're facing right now. There are other industries who have used pricing as a way to steer demand towards off-peak times, for example. So if you look at the Swiss Railroad, for example, SBB, they've been using this concept for years now because they always have an issue on the Zurich-Geneva and Zurich-Bern trains around 5 to 6 p.m. And so they try to steer their passengers to trains that leave either earlier or later than that. And pricing is a good way to do that, of course. And so right now, I think also bus companies in regulated markets who want to introduce dynamic pricing can use that as an argument to improve their negotiation position. But again, if everything is completely regulated, it's regulated full stop. So don't want to make any promises I couldn't keep.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Max Alexander. It was very interesting.